On the night of March 28, 1942, 234 RAF bombers approached the Baltic coast of Germany carrying a weapon that would redefine aerial warfare. They were not carrying the standard high-explosive bombs that had characterized strategic bombing up to that point. Instead, their bomb bays were filled with thousands of 4-pound magnesium incendiaries, each one a stick of metal that burned at temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Celsius. The target was Lübeck, a medieval city on the Baltic coast whose strategic importance lay not in its factories or military installations, but in its vulnerability. Lübeck was built of wood and thatch. Its streets were narrow, its buildings tightly packed, its construction dating back centuries to an era when fire was the constant enemy. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, newly appointed commander of RAF Bomber Command, had chosen it deliberately. He wanted to demonstrate what incendiary weapons could accomplish against German cities. What he could not have known was that the fire his bombers started would destroy not just a city, but 22 warships and reshape Germany's entire naval construction program. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany in early 1942 was failing by nearly every measure. The RAF's doctrine emphasized precision attacks on industrial targets, oil refineries, aircraft factories, the infrastructure that sustained Germany's war machine. But precision required daylight bombing, and daylight bombing against German air defenses had proven catastrophically expensive. The switch to night operations preserved crews and aircraft, but destroyed accuracy. Bombers navigating by dead reckoning in darkness, sometimes through clouds and anti-aircraft fire, rarely found their assigned targets and almost never hit them. Reconnaissance photographs showed that most bombs fell in open countryside. The cities being bombed often didn't realize they had been attacked. Something had to change, or the entire strategic bombing effort would be revealed as an expensive failure. Harris believed the answer lay not in precision, but in area bombardment. If bombers could not reliably hit specific factories, they could reliably hit cities. And if those cities could be set on fire with incendiary weapons, the fires would destroy industrial capacity, even if the bombs themselves missed their intended targets. Fire consumed factories and warehouses, melted machinery, blocked transportation routes, diverted resources to firefighting and reconstruction. Most importantly, fire broke civilian morale in ways that high explosive could not. A population that had survived conventional bombing might not survive their city burning around them. The theory was ruthless. The implementation would be worse. Lübeck was chosen because it was combustible, because it was within range of RAF bombers operating from Britain, and because its importance was significant but not critical enough to warrant overwhelming defenses. The city's medieval core, designated as a protected historical area before the war, was a labyrinth of half-timbered houses whose construction dated back to the Hanseatic League. The buildings leaned against each other across streets barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The roofs were wooden shingles, the walls wattle and daub beneath decorative facades. In modern firefighting terms, Lübeck was a conflagration waiting to happen. All it needed was ignition. The naval significance of Lübeck was considerable, but not immediately obvious. The city itself had no major shipyards or naval bases. But 6 miles to the north, along the Trave River, lay a complex of submarine construction facilities and naval workshops that contributed significantly to Germany's U-boat campaign. These facilities were built to wartime expansion standards, prefabricated structures, wooden annexes, temporary housing, and they were even more vulnerable to fire than the medieval city centre. More critically, the Lübeck dockyards hosted vessels under repair or refit, surface ships that had been damaged in action or were being converted for new roles. 22 such ships were in port on the night of March 28th. By dawn, on March 29th, all of them would be destroyed. The raid began shortly after midnight. The first aircraft over the target were pathfinders, experienced crews tasked with marking the aim point for the main force. They carried a mix of incendiaries and high explosives, the latter intended to crater roads and rupture water mains so that firefighting would be hampered. The incendiaries fell in clusters, igniting immediately on impact, their magnesium cores burning with an intensity that wood and water could not extinguish. Magnesium fires cannot be doused with water. The reaction between burning magnesium and water produces hydrogen gas, which explodes, spreading the fire further. The only way to stop a magnesium fire is to smother it with sand or dirt, cutting off its oxygen supply. In a city under aerial bombardment, with thousands of fires igniting simultaneously, such firefighting was impossible. The main bomber stream followed the pathfinders at intervals, each aircraft releasing its load over the marked target area before turning for home. The standard load was a mix of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries, the explosives intended to spread destruction and prevent firefighting, the incendiaries to start and sustain fires. But some aircraft carried nothing but incendiaries, thousands of 4-pound sticks that tumbled from bomb bays and scattered across rooftops and streets. When they ignited, they burned through wooden roofs, fell into attics filled with centuries of accumulated debris, and set the interiors of buildings ablaze before fire crews could even identify which structures were threatened. The fires spread from house to house, jumped streets, merged into firestorms that created their own weather. The attack lasted barely 90 minutes. The fires burned for 3 days. The temperature in the heart of the firestorm exceeded 1,000 degrees. At such temperatures, wood does not burn so much as it vaporizes, releasing gases that ignite in explosive deflagration. Stone cracks and crumbles, glass melts and flows like syrup, metal softens and bends. Human bodies carbonize in minutes, their organic material converted to ash and carbon shadows on pavement. The medieval city centre of Lübeck, 1,000 years of history and culture, was reduced to rubble and ash in a single night. But the naval facilities 6 miles upriver suffered even worse. The wind, driven by the fire's own convection, carried burning debris across the river and into the shipyard complex. Within hours, the temporary wooden structures that housed workshops and equipment storage were fully involved. Within the wooden buildings were machine tools, electronics, optical equipment, spare parts for submarines, everything needed to maintain and repair the U-boats that were strangling Britain's supply lines. All of it burned. The ships docked along the Trave were helpless. Some were already damaged from combat action and could not be moved. Others were undergoing refit, their machinery disassembled, their compartments opened for maintenance. The fires reached them not through direct bombing. The dockyards were never the primary target, but through the wind-borne embers and the spreading flames from burning warehouses. Wooden scaffolding around hulls caught fire. Fuel oil leaking from ruptured tanks ignited. Paint and preservatives applied during maintenance burned with toxic intensity. The heat from surrounding fires created conditions inside the ships that were incompatible with survival. Crews attempting to move vessels or fight fires aboard them were driven off by temperatures that made metal too hot to touch and air too hot to breathe. By morning, 22 surface vessels, destroyers, escorts, converted merchant ships, training vessels were either burned to the waterline or damaged beyond economical repair. The immediate German response was shock, followed by rage. Goebbels's propaganda machine characterized the Lübeck raid as terrorism against a defenseless cultural center, an attack on civilian targets that violated the laws of war. The characterization was not entirely wrong. Lübeck's military significance was secondary to its vulnerability. Harris had chosen it because it would burn, because its destruction would demonstrate what the RAF could accomplish with incendiary weapons. The death toll, over 300 civilians killed, thousands more injured or displaced, was presented as evidence of British barbarity. What Goebbels did not mention was that the raid had also eliminated 22 ships that Germany could not afford to lose and destroyed U-boat maintenance facilities at a time when the submarine campaign in the Atlantic was reaching its peak intensity. The loss of the ships was catastrophic, but not immediately decisive. Germany's naval construction capacity was distributed across multiple yards, and vessels could be replaced given time and resources. But the destruction of the maintenance facilities at Lübeck created a logistics problem with strategic implications. U-boats operating in the Atlantic required regular overhaul to remain effective. Engines needed maintenance, batteries required replacement, hulls accumulated damage from depth charges that had to be repaired. The Lübeck facilities had been handling a significant portion of this work, particularly for boats operating in the northern Atlantic. Their destruction created a backlog that other yards could not immediately absorb. Boats that should have been refitted and returned to service remained in port, awaiting maintenance that could not be provided. The tempo of the U-boat campaign slowed at exactly the moment when Germany most needed to press its advantage. The strategic response to Lübeck was even more significant than the immediate losses. Hitler, enraged by the destruction of a German city, ordered retaliatory raids against British cultural targets. This led to the Baedeker raids, attacks on cathedral cities like Bath, Exeter, and Canterbury, chosen for their historical importance rather than their military value. These raids were militarily pointless but politically satisfying, revenge attacks that demonstrated Germany's continued ability to strike Britain. They also diverted Luftwaffe resources from more productive targets and marked the beginning of a destructive escalation that would culminate in the firestorms of Hamburg, Dresden, and dozens of other German cities. The fires at Lübeck, in other words, established a pattern that would eventually consume Germany itself. For RAF Bomber Command, Lübeck was proof of concept. The raid demonstrated that area bombardment with incendiary weapons could achieve destruction far exceeding what precision attacks with high explosives could accomplish. The loss rate, 12 aircraft out of 234, roughly 5%, was acceptable by the standards of strategic bombing. The damage achieved, an entire city center destroyed, naval facilities eliminated, thousands of tons of shipping lost, justified the resources expended. Harris would apply the lessons of Lübeck to larger cities, developing the tactics that would culminate in the 1,000-bomber raids and the deliberate firestorms. The moral questions raised by area bombing would be debated for decades. The effectiveness, at least in terms of destruction achieved, was undeniable. The technology of the Magnesium incendiary was deceptively simple. Each stick was a hollow tube of magnesium alloy filled with thermite, a mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide that burns at approximately 2,500 degrees Celsius. When dropped from altitude, a fuse ignited the thermite, which in turn ignited the magnesium casing. The resulting fire was self-sustaining, burning with such intensity that it could ignite virtually any combustible material it contacted. The 4-pound weight made the devices easy to handle and pack efficiently in bomb bays. A single bomber could carry thousands of them. A raid involving hundreds of bombers could deliver incendiaries by the tens of thousands. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. The physics of magnesium fires made them particularly devastating. Magnesium combustion is an oxidation reaction that proceeds rapidly at high temperatures, releasing enormous energy in the form of heat and light. The reaction is exothermic, meaning it generates more heat than is required to sustain it, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Once ignited, a magnesium fire will burn through its fuel source without requiring external heat input. The intense heat radiates outward, igniting nearby combustibles and creating secondary fires that spread the destruction. In an urban environment with multiple ignition points, these secondary fires merge into area conflagrations that cannot be controlled by conventional firefighting methods. The water reaction problem made magnesium fires especially dangerous for firefighters. When water contacts burning magnesium, the intense heat breaks water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen, being flammable, ignites immediately, creating an explosion that sprays burning magnesium fragments over a wider area. Firefighters trained to combat conventional fires found their standard tactics worse than useless against magnesium incendiaries. Directing water streams at burning buildings could spread fires rather than extinguish them. The only effective response was to cover individual incendiaries with sand or dirt before they penetrated into building interiors, a task that was impossible when thousands of devices were falling simultaneously across multiple city blocks. The German civil defense organization, despite its sophistication and preparation, was overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the Lübeck fires. Pre-war planning had assumed that bombing raids would involve high explosives against specific targets, allowing firefighters to concentrate resources at individual impact sites. The reality of area incendiary attack rendered such planning obsolete. Fires started faster than crews could respond to them. Water mains ruptured by high explosive bombs could not provide pressure for fire hoses. Streets blocked by rubble prevented fire engines from reaching affected areas. The fire created its own wind patterns, pulling oxygen into the combustion zone and pushing superheated air outward, making approach impossible. Firefighters who attempted to enter the worst affected areas were driven back by heat, smoke, and the collapse of burning structures. The aftermath of the raid revealed the full extent of naval losses. The 22 ships destroyed or damaged beyond repair included vessels of multiple types and roles. Several were destroyer escorts that had been conducting anti-submarine warfare in the Baltic, protecting convoys from Soviet submarine attacks. Their loss weakened Germany's ability to secure its own coastal shipping lanes. Others were training vessels used to prepare crews for combat operations, their destruction creating gaps in the personnel pipeline that would affect fleet readiness months later. Still others were auxiliary vessels, converted merchant ships that provided logistical support to naval operations. Each loss was individually manageable. Collectively, they represented a significant degradation of Germany's naval capacity at a time when resources were already stretched thin. The U-boat maintenance problem proved particularly intractable. The Lübeck facilities had specialized in certain types of repairs, particularly electrical systems and battery maintenance. areas where expertise and equipment were not easily replicated. Boats that required such work now had to be redirected to other yards, creating transportation costs and delays. Some boats were sent to Norwegian bases for maintenance, extending their time out of action. Others remained in German ports, awaiting capacity that did not exist. The cumulative effect was a reduction in operational availability, fewer boats on patrol in the Atlantic, reduced sinking rates against Allied convoys. The impact was measurable in statistics that showed U-boat effectiveness declining through 1942, a decline that had multiple causes but to which Lübeck contributed. The propaganda battle over Lübeck highlighted the moral complexities of strategic bombing. German media portrayed the raid as an atrocity, emphasizing the cultural significance of the city and the civilian casualties. British media responded by noting Lübeck's military importance, though the specifics of what was destroyed were not revealed for security reasons. The truth, as usual, was complex. Lübeck was both a cultural treasure and a military target, both an innocent city and a contributor to the war effort. The decision to attack it with incendiaries was motivated by military logic and also by the desire to demonstrate capability, to inflict pain on Germany, to show that Britain could strike back. The civilians who died were not combatants, but were also not entirely disconnected from the war. Total war blurs such distinctions, and the fires at Lübeck were very much a product of total war. The architectural loss was staggering and permanent. Lübeck's medieval city centre, recognized as one of the finest examples of Hanseatic Gothic architecture, was largely destroyed. The Marienkirche, a 13th-century church whose bells were famous throughout northern Germany, was gutted by fire. The Holstentor, the iconic city gate that symbolized Lübeck's medieval prosperity, survived but was damaged. Hundreds of historic buildings, each a unique example of construction techniques and design aesthetics from past centuries, were reduced to rubble. Post-war reconstruction would rebuild the city, but much of what was lost could not be replicated. The knowledge of how medieval craftsmen had constructed certain elements died with the buildings that embodied it. For the bomber crews who flew the mission, Lübeck was memorable for its vulnerability and the visual spectacle of the fires. Crews returning from the target reported seeing the glow of the burning city from over 100 miles away, a dome of light against the darkness that marked their navigation back to Britain. The fires were so intense that later waves of bombers had difficulty identifying specific aim points because the entire target area was obscured by smoke and flames. This was both a success, the fires were clearly achieving the intended destruction, and a problem, because bomber accuracy depended on being able to see what was being targeted. The lesson was not lost on Harris, who would develop improved target marking techniques for subsequent raids. The scientific analysis of the Lübeck raid informed the development of more effective incendiary weapons and tactics. Post-raid reconnaissance revealed which types of construction were most vulnerable, which weather conditions favored fire spread, which bombing patterns created the most concentrated damage. This information was used to refine the mix of explosives and incendiaries, to improve the timing and spacing of aircraft over the target, to select future targets based on their combustibility. The study of Lübeck was the foundation for the science of urban firestorms, a discipline that would reach its terrible apex in Hamburg 15 months later when 40,000 people died in a single night. The long-term impact on German naval strategy was subtle but significant. The loss of the maintenance facilities and the 22 ships forced a re-evaluation of where resources should be concentrated. Germany's surface fleet had already proven unable to challenge Allied naval supremacy in the Atlantic. The destruction at Lübeck reinforced the conclusion that surface ships were vulnerable to air attack and that resources should be concentrated on submarines, which could operate submerged and were less susceptible to strategic bombing. This shift in emphasis, more U-boats, fewer surface vessels, was already underway, but was accelerated by Lübeck. The unintended consequence was that Germany doubled down on the one weapon system that was actually threatening Britain's survival. The human cost of the raid was borne primarily by German civilians who had no direct role in military operations. Over 300 people died, most of them from carbon monoxide poisoning or burns sustained while trying to escape the fires. Thousands more were injured, suffered smoke inhalation, or were left homeless when their dwellings burned. The psychological trauma was significant. Survivors reported nightmares, anxiety, an inability to feel safe in cities, symptoms that would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The moral question of whether such suffering was justified by military necessity was debated at the time and continues to be debated today. Harris believed it was necessary. Many of his contemporaries disagreed. The precedent set by Lübeck influenced the conduct of the air war for the remainder of the conflict. Both sides would escalate their use of incendiary weapons, seeking to replicate the destruction achieved on that March night. The Baedeker raids were Germany's immediate response. The RAF's subsequent attacks on Rostock, Cologne, and eventually Hamburg were Britain's escalation. The Americans, initially committed to precision daylight bombing, would eventually adopt incendiary tactics for the bombing of Japan, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. The path from Lübeck to Tokyo was not direct, but the connection was clear. Incendiary weapons, once proven effective, became the standard tool for area bombardment. The ships destroyed at Lübeck represented not just material losses, but also the death of strategic options. Each vessel had represented potential, a capacity to conduct operations, to fulfill missions, to influence events. Their destruction foreclosed possibilities, narrowed Germany's range of choices, forced adaptation to reduced capabilities. This is how strategic bombing works when it is effective, not necessarily by destroying specific critical assets, but by degrading overall capacity, by forcing the enemy to operate within constraints, by making them weaker and less flexible. The 22 ships lost at Lübeck were not irreplaceable individually, but their loss, combined with losses elsewhere, contributed to a cumulative degradation that eventually became decisive. The firestorm at Lübeck was both a technical achievement and a moral catastrophe. It demonstrated that modern aerial warfare could achieve levels of destruction that previous generations could not have imagined. It proved that incendiary weapons could be more effective than high explosives for certain targets. It established tactics that would be refined and repeated throughout the war. It also killed hundreds of civilians, destroyed cultural treasures, and set a precedent for escalation that would lead to even greater destruction. Whether the military gains justified the human cost is a question that each generation must answer according to its own values and understanding of war's necessities. The night of March 28, 1942, marked a turning point in the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Before Lübeck, the effectiveness of area bombing was theoretical. After Lübeck, it was demonstrated fact. The RAF had found a weapon that worked, a tactic that achieved measurable results, a method of warfare that Germany could not adequately defend against. The price of that discovery was paid by the people of Lübeck, by the crews of the 22 ships that burned in the dockyards, by the cultural heritage that was destroyed and cannot be recovered. The fire that could not be put out changed more than just the tactical approach to strategic bombing. It changed the nature of the war itself, making total war more total, making the distinction between combatant and civilian less meaningful, making the path to victory run through the deliberate destruction of cities and the people who lived in them. 6 hours of bombing, 1,200 degrees of heat, 22 ships destroyed, one medieval city reduced to ash. The raid on Lübeck demonstrated what modern warfare could accomplish when technology and ruthlessness combined. The lesson was learned by both sides and applied with increasing ferocity until the war's end. The fires have long since been extinguished, but the questions they raised continue to burn.